we will begin, I just wanted to invite everybody to say a few words in the chat about where you're joining us from, about the Indigenous territories or treaties from which you are listening and engaging with this talk. And now I begin a land acknowledgement of my own. My name is Professor Fiona Nicol. I work in the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta. And my acknowledgement, both as a worker and a permanent resident in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territories, a place where Indigenous sovereignty is not relegated to a traditional past, but is ongoing through each and every generation. I often find my orientations as a queer white woman from Australia in the Sweetgrass Bear sculpture in the University of Alberta Quad. It was installed as part of the University of Alberta's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this artwork expresses beautifully the connections between the human and non-human beings in its documentation, its commemoration, and its embodiment of the spirit of Treaty 6. The Sweetgrass Bear materialises in Cree syllabics and granted an urgent epistemological shift to understand Wakotawan, or how we are all related in this time and place. Having said this, I'm speaking to you in Canada from tomorrow morning in Australia, so it's weird. Natalie, could I have the next slide, please? I'm zooming from Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And it's the first time I've been back since my mother was buried on a day of bushfires that saw Melbourne counted as the city with the worst air in the world. It was the 14th of January, 2020. My mother was an artist and born and raised in Yorta Yorta country, where I spent the last week and was lucky to be present for the opening of the new Shepparton Art Museum. Shepparton is a large regional centre in central northern Victoria. A highlight of this was a retrospective exhibition of works by the late painter, sculptor and activist Lynn Onus. Like Fiona Foley, Lynn Onus was part of a movement of contemporary Indigenous artists to reframe the landscape and historical narratives that make up dominant mythologies of Australianness. And his painting plays with different ways of seeing the country as a jigsaw puzzle. And I think it resonates with some of the ideas that Fiona is going to explore today in her reflections on the cultural politics of fire. Now, you may notice that we have sign language interpretation available for this Zoom. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce the two ASL interpreters here with us today, Judy Morrison and Catherine Beeson. So thanks so much, Jody and Catherine, for being here. For those who are visually impaired, I'm a white woman wearing a colourful jacket, and I need a haircut. I still have COVID hair. Now I'd like to briefly introduce the Scholars Program, which has made this possible. So this event is co-sponsored by the Research Creation and Social Justice Co-Laboratories Art, Activism and Global Crisis series. It's funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Australia. Where am I? Who am I? I'm Canada, and the Cool Institute of Advanced Studies Cool Scholar Program. This Cool Scholars Program is designed to support and reward research excellence in social sciences, humanities and arts at the University of Alberta. It brings together select researchers from different disciplinary backgrounds and methodological approaches for a 3-year non-renewable term to focus on a research theme aligned with KIAS research priorities. So Shirley Harper, Suryan Mukherjee, Selena Coulter, and are part of this group together with me. And we are led by the always inspirational research creationist, Natalie Lovelace. So huge thanks to Natalie and Kias for making this conversation with Fiona possible today. Now, just a note on housekeeping is that this conversation is structured deliberately to allow Fiona and the audience to benefit from comments, questions and reflections from scholars who are working most closely on topics that Fiona's work engages. So our first responses will come from Canada Research Chair in Comparative Indigenous Feminist Studies, Professor Isabel Altamirano Jimenez, and from Lana Whiskeyjack, who's an innovative art actionist and educator here at the University of Alberta. After Isabel and Lana's comments or questions, we're then going to invite responses from the Cool Scholar group before we open up to your general questions, which I'm inviting you to put in the Zoom chat, and I will read those out on your behalf. I want to mark the importance of this way of creating conversations across the borders of white possessive states. And there I'm citing Aileen Morton Robinson on the white possessive. These states have policies, both historical and present, that often aim to contain and attempt to domesticate the lives of Indigenous people and their politics. And this colonial dynamic often makes projects that strengthen transnational political and cultural connections and solidarities challenging, in comparison to the ways that capital, persons and values attached to resource extraction are lubricated continuously to keep flowing across state borders. The colonial state containment of vital Indigenous knowledges and the relentless expansion of extractive industries are fuels on the fire of the devastating climate events and the diseases that follow along with them, which we are becoming increasingly familiar. So now the pleasure and slightly daunting task of introducing Dr. Fiona Foley to you in Australia and in Canada. As academics, we're often asked to demonstrate the impact of our work upon the wider societies within and on behalf of which we work. Fiona Foley has left an indelible mark on our culture and on our urban and our regional landscapes. And I think it carves deeper than most of us will ever be able to create in many ways. She's a founding member of the Bamali Artists Co-op and one of the most influential public artists in Australia over a career that spans nearly 4 decades, with works represented in major collections in Australia and internationally. Her public exhibitions regularly break attendance records, and she's a highly sought after public speaker. She's the winner of the Australian Council Artist of the Year Award, among many other prizes, including most recently, the Premier's Book Award for a work of state significance for Biting the Clouds, a bachelor perspective on the Aboriginal protections and restriction of the sale of opium Act 1897. And there is a link to this in the chat. So you can buy that from the University of Queensland Press. It's a fantastic book, and the combination of images and historical information and argumentation is really stunning. As you will hear this morning and this afternoon, Fiona comes from a family that's been active in culture and politics over several generations, with her mother Shirley compiling an invaluable dictionary of the Butchulla language. Fiona's life and career have made her the subject of at least 2 published biographical studies, and her artworks and writing are frequently cited by researchers across disciplines of Australian studies, Australian history, political science, sociology, and the fine arts. A highlight of my own career was working with Fiona at the University of Queensland as she curated a decolonising art installation titled Courting Blackness, Recalibrating Knowledge in the Sandstone University, with 8 Aboriginal artists and leading performers at the opening, including Ryan Presley, Michael Cook, Archie Moore, Ree, Natalie Harkin, Megan Cope, Carla Dickens, Christian Thompson, Warraba Wetherell, Romaine Morton, Lou Bennett and Tilia Watson. Having seen Fiona's mentorship of the coming generation of Indigenous artists up close, I'm really delighted that she'll soon be receiving an honorary doctorate from the University of Queensland, in addition to her PhD from Griffith University, where she's a senior lecturer. As a member of the Cool Scholar cohort dedicated to the theme of climate resilience, I invited Fiona to share reflections on fire after she shared with me some recent works about the fires that consumed much of Kagari from her series, The Magna Carta Tree. The resonance of her work with climate events in Canada, most recently the devastating floods in BC, prompted me to invite her to lead us today in a transnational conversation about the artist's role in shifting knowledges and actions in response to our changing environments and human and non-human relationalities. So with that, welcome Fiona, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to especially thank Professor Fiona Nicol for the invitation today to speak to you from Australia, and her esteemed academic colleagues from the University of Alberta. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people from Meanjin, also known as Brisbane. And so my paper that I will delivered today is principally about fire in Australia. So first slide, please. As a child, I grew up with my Wandana clan belonging to the Butchler Nation. We are the traditional landowners for the largest sand island in the world, called Gari, previously known as Fraser Island. On the mainland, our boundaries include the mouth of the Burrum River in the north, Bopple Mountain in the west, and Tin Can Bay and Double Island Point in the south. The same year I was born was also the same year my great uncle Wolfie and great auntie Olga published The Legends of Moonee Jarl. They were brother and sister. It is recognised as the first Aboriginal children's book to be authored by Aboriginal people in Australia. I will take a moment to read the story of how fire came to the Butchler people at the beginning of time. Sometime after Mingan had been banished from the tribe, there came a great storm, and for weeks and weeks it rained without stopping. When finally it did stop, the people found they had no fire, and as they had not yet learned how to make it for themselves, they were very cold and miserable. They asked the birds if one of them could fly up to the sun and bring them back some fire. The birds all tried to help. One by one they tried, but none of them, not even the eagles, could fly high enough. Now, one little bird was wiser than the others. One night, when all were asleep, this little bird flew out across the sea. All night long he flew, just above the water. He reached the sun just as it was coming up above the sea in the early morning. He had flown into the east. Later that afternoon, when all the birds had given up trying to reach the sun, the people were bemoaning their fate. The only person who could have helped them was Mingan, and if they wanted him to call the Indingi, they would have to give him back his magic stone. Suddenly, when they had almost given up hope, the little bird appeared, carrying on his back a red-hot coal. Very soon there were fires all over the land, and everyone was warm and happy again. It was decided to hold a great feast in honour of the little firebird, as we now call him, but he was nowhere to be seen. He had hidden himself away in the thick scrub, and there you will find him to this day, a small grey bird about the size of a sparrow. He still has the mark of that hot coal on his back. He is very hard to see, even though on his back is a bright scarlet spot, for he keeps mainly to the high trees that grow in the thick rainforests. If you do see him, remember this warning. If you try to harm him, you will never grow up. Next slide, please. A raging fire is pure energy unleashed. That's what I love about the British electronic dance music of the Prodigy. Their song Firestarter is full of uncontrollable energy. I saw the Prodigy play once in Cape Town, South Africa. It was a mixture of deep fear and giving yourself over to witnessing the spectacle of impending excitement. Next slide, thanks. Numerous Firestarters visited us last year in Australia, some through lightning strike, some through human hand. For those of us who could, we watched the uncontrollable wildfires across the nation in 2019 and 2020 on news channels as they brought us daily and hourly updates. I remember watching the forecast for hours and even the news cycle repeats on the ABC. I was fixated. In the safety of my Brisbane suburban home with the air conditioning switched on and in my pyjamas, a number of people lost their lives, including volunteer firefighters. Images of these gallant men and women played on my mind. I took it to heart when a father and son from Kangaroo Island in South Australia lost their lives fighting fires on Saturday, the 4th of January, 2020. Dick Lang, aged 78, and his son Clayton, aged 43, a surgeon. It was reported on the ABC News that the fires were described as virtually unstoppable. Their bodies were found in a vehicle. Then it all got too much for me. I could tell I was being affected psychologically by the disasters in what seemed like a long season from December 2019 into Christmas and New Year of 2020. I had to change tack and stop watching the news. Next slide, please. I donated to wildlife funds for injured koalas in 2 states of New South Wales and South Australia. I watched film footage of koalas being rescued during the fires following the fires where their habitat had been burned to charcoal. They were sometimes found sitting on the ground, dehydrated, as food was scarce in the high canopy. Many animal species perished in Australia, including birds and kangaroos. One headline read, half of the total population of koalas on Kangaroo Island, estimated losses to be 25,000 koalas killed. Kangaroo Island was not the only island to be affected by wildfires in 2020. Indeed, my island home of Gari, the largest sand island in the world, took the brunt of wildfires a little earlier in the fire season from the 14th of October to the 16th of December, which I will go into a little more detail later in this paper. Next slide, please. The Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, left Australia for a holiday in Hawaii, then decided to return when the press and media reports conveyed the outrage of Australians left here to battle the bushfire crisis. The Prime Minister said, "I deeply regret any offence caused to any of the many Australians affected by the terrible bushfires by my taking leave with my family at this time." It is known that Australia continues to be reliant on coal-fired power plants and has one of the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions rates in the world. Mr. Morrison reiterated his position that Australia was carrying its weight when it came to combating climate change on the global stage. On the 11th of November 2019, New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian called a state emergency for 7 days. She called 2 more states of emergency on the 19th of December and again on the 2nd of January. The hottest temperature in 2020 was recorded on January 4th at 48.9 degrees Celsius for Penrith during the wildfires emergency in the Sydney region. Sydney was covered in smoke and air pollution was at a crisis. New South Wales had over 100 fires burning, and on some days there were 170 fires burning. New South Wales Fire Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons was in charge of 72,000 largely volunteer firefighters belonging to the Rural Fire Service of New South Wales. The biggest challenge as a leader during the period, he said, was motivating exhausted people to simply keep turning up day after day, week after week, month after month. Next slide, please. What I can't factor in here is the sound of fire as eucalyptus trees explode in fireballs. During this time, as teams of volunteer firefighters in uniform were moved from various locations interstate, I remember the reception they would receive at airports. It would be spontaneous, loud applause from other passengers at our airport lounges. Next slide, please. By early December, international news reports were coming out of the United Kingdom on the BBC regarding the smoke blanketing Sydney and its renowned icons such as the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Sydney Opera House and Bondi Beach. Locals described the situation as apocalyptic and insane. Adding to the sense of apocalypse was the ash falling from the sky and washing up on the sandy northern beaches. Social media featured footage by Imogen Brennan of Balmoral Beach with black ash in the water and shoreline covered in black sludge. Climate action protests were held outside the Prime Minister's Sydney house. In addition, on the 11th of December 2019, there was the UN Climate Change Conference, COP25 in Madrid. Next slide, please. In Sydney, an estimated 20,000 people attended the New South Wales is Burning, Sydney is Choking climate emergency rally gathered at Sydney's Town Hall to Hyde Park, organised by Extinction Rebellion, uni students for climate justice and Greens MP David Shoebridge. Following a day where thick haze set off smoke alarms and visibility was poor, causing chaos in the city. Now the result is here: unprecedented drought, bushfires, and now a massive health crisis with millions choking and no escape. The severe consequences for people's immediate and long-term health, they wrote on a Facebook page for the event. Next slide, please. Australia has received broad criticism internationally for its climate policies, with a group of think tanks recently ranking the nation the worst performing country on climate change from a list of 57. Contained within the Climate Change Performance Index report 2020, Australia continues to promote the expansion of fossil fuels, and in April 2019, approved the opening of the highly controversial Adani coal mine. Next slide, please. How does art intersect with climate resilience? My understanding is that ecological violence is tied to violence against Indigenous peoples. Major ecological destruction on the east coast of Australia was a forewarning of what was to come and would be replicated elsewhere. The loss of plant species is rarely spoken about today and adds to the long list of forgotten Australian history. Greed was at the heart of this colony's rapid expansion and has been ever present since. Two Australian plant species make this tragically evident. Bunya trees and red cedar, often referred to as red gold, were targeted. The natural timber stocks of these trees were decimated, giving an insight into the colonial man's rapacious lust for wealth. Majestic stands of bunya trees and red cedar once thrived in the wilds of New South Wales and Queensland. Plundered in the early 1800s, an economy boomed and then vanished entirely as a single species. In this case, red cedar in New South Wales was cut into extinction. The bunya trees were a food source for Aboriginal nations who would feast on these nuts. the decimation of tree species is interchangeable with the decimation of human life. When the elite classes of squattocracy moved further north, there were new lands to exploit. Natural resources were there for the taking. The invaders were not only decimating the traditional Butchler people, but were also colonising the land's resources for their own gain. Businessmen would scout the terrain of the Wide Bay region, surveying it for future profitability. Keen eyes were on the hunt for stands of timber. Softwood and hardwood were extracted from gurry, including carry pine, hoop pine, blackbutt, and saturnae. A commercial sawmill was established on the banks of the Merry River at Dundathu by business partners William Pettigrew and William Simon in 1863. In Maryborough, Wilson Hart and Company Limited established a sawmill in 1867, and Hine and Son opened the National Sawmill in 1882. To speak to the contemporaneity of my art, I have to speak to Australia's history. Making art and being commissioned to create public art for designated spaces is about engaging in a visual language. I ask myself, what do I want to communicate to a general public? My work can be layered with meaning, straddling an analysis involving history, law, Indigenous knowledge, and creative research. It touches on all these strands. Next slide, please. The Australian population commemorates every year Anzac Day on the 25th of April. The day begins before daybreak with dawn services across the country. The term "lest we forget" is used to reflect upon wars and that they should not be forgotten. Death was prevalent on this continent long before Anzac Day was created in 1915. Most of the national war talk is about Australian soldiers who left these shores and fought in overseas wars on foreign soils. The bloody frontier wars carried out on Australian soil are often a hidden history buried deep and silenced. In my publication, Biting the Clouds, I interview renowned historian Raymond Evans for the film A Quintessential Act. He categorically stated that the frontier wars caused a decline in the Queensland Aboriginal population of 95%. There is no going back from that figure. I have been probing the larger picture of what took place in Queensland for a number of decades. This has led to some serious analysis about race relations and massacres in the state where I was born and currently live. Next slide, please. From my various readings on frontier violence in the state of Queensland, I came across a quote from Frederick Walker, Commandant of the Native Police Force in New South Wales and later Queensland between 1848 to 1854. He referred to the Butchler people as the charcoals of Fraser Island. Commandant Frederick Walker was on a hunting expedition for one species of humans with a large posse in tow. This consisted of Lieutenant Marshal, Sergeant Dolan, and 3 divisions of native police troopers, along with 4 local squatters, the captain and crew of the schooner Margaret and Mary. One of the most infamous accounts of a massacre taking place on Fraser Island was on Christmas Eve 1851, during an 11-day reprisal. There was no body count following the massacre of Butchler men, women and children in any official report. Silence was used as a counterweight. Fire has been used as another tool in the arsenal of the frontier wars and sinister pathology to destroy. This time as a methodology of getting rid of the evidence through burning Aboriginal bodies. With this understanding resonating for me, it led to a major work outside of Brisbane Magistrates Court in 2004. The research conducted and engraved into the pavers are the place names of where massacres in the state of Queensland had occurred. These were accessible on the public record. The list of names came to 94. This is not to say that the list is finalised, but it was a comprehensive first start. 5 vertical columns exhibit 3 faces of fine ash as reference to this methodology of burning the evidence so judicial cases could not be brought to trial. Next slide, please. Charcoal opium is a term I came across when researching a piece of legislation titled the Aboriginals Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act 1897. This is when opium has already been smoked, leaving a residue ash. The ash was given to Aboriginal labourers in lieu of payment and to addict a people's reliance on this substance. I have used the words charcoal opium on a breastplate, a construct of the British given to a designated Aboriginal leader of their choosing, often engraved with the name denoting a status, such as king or queen, when no such classification existed prior to English arrivals. I mimic a colonial trope by naming other realities for Indigenes. Next slide, please. Time or deep time is something I explore in my recent essay, Exploding Time Past and Time Present, published in Griffith Review. I look back to my bachelor country during the 13th century, when a young grey mangrove was taking root some 738 years ago on the muddy intertidal zone adjacent to the coursing pulse of the Merry River by Wright. Next slide. Back in time, the Butchulla people traversed to and from the mainland and the islands of Great Sandy Strait with ease. What if I could be transplanted back to 13th century Australia before the madness of the colonial project took hold? What images would I discover on the old land? Next slide, please. Trees are featured in my new photographic series titled The Magna Carta Tree. Like sentinel beings, they watch over country and people. Next slide, please. From a 738-year-old grey mangrove, paper barks in the tea tree swamp, a fig tree at Bagimba Creek Mission, and a half-burnt eucalyptus tree found following the wildfires on the western side of the island. They all play a central role in this new series. I use charcoal. It's a metaphor in my art as a way in which to research and express historical race relations in Australia. Memory and memorial ash are a provocation. The utilisation of charcoal and ash are materials that have weaved in and out of my art practice to articulate a broader societal narrative, underpinned either by coarse black charcoal or fine grey ash. It is a representation of either sex or death. Next slide, please. I was always curious to know about the relationship between Aboriginal women and white men historically. With an uneasy feeling, I began the detective work in this area, as much of it is shrouded in secrecy. I found one clue in the publication Trauma Trails by Aboriginal author and academic Judy Atkinson. She writes, a whole language evolved in Australia around the sexual violations of Aboriginal women. Gin bus, gin sprees, gin jockey, gin shepherds. Aboriginal women were pursued like sport. Society viewed sexual violations of Indigenous women as familiar male sporting events. Atkinson also identifies the role of white women played in history. White women maintained their silence in their denial of the reality of this violence. Other derogatory terms used for Aboriginal women are stud gins and black velvet. The situation was barbaric, with Germaine Greer writing, in 1900 at Ardok Station in Queensland, 9 Aboriginal women were kept in a fence compound for the use of white station hands. In 2013, I made a short film titled Vexed on the Todd River, a dry creek bed in Alice Springs, using 9 quotes from On Rage by Germaine Greer. Aboriginal country and Western singer Warren H. William speaks these quotes direct to camera. Traditional marriages or promised marriages between Aboriginal men and Aboriginal women were shattered by the colonial project of invasion, molestation, raping, kidnapping, and removal of Aboriginal girls and women from their families. Next slide, please. I love the symbol I created in the early part of my career for female sexuality by using the elliptical shape of a vulva. The central shape is fire engine red using chilies, and the outer elliptical shape is midnight black using chunky charcoal. A large number of these works have the title Black Velvet. My art is littered with multiple salient analysis pertaining to the sexual violence against Aboriginal women. But like other important political works of mine, they largely remain uncollected by Australian art institutions. Next slide, please. Twisted thinking governs the state of Queensland. Minister for the Environment, Megan Scanlon, said on the 25th of May this year, I quote, "We know that visits to our national parks generate 2.6 billion in economic activity each year. And as home to the world's largest sand island, K'gari plays a big role," end quote. Next slide, please. Since our native title consent determination in 2014, over the past 7 years, millions and millions of tourists have gone to K'gari, and not 1 cent has gone back to the Butchulla people or the Butchulla Aboriginal Corporation. K'gari is a national park managed by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. It is also World Heritage listed. To gain access to the island, a permit system operates and brings in revenue of millions of dollars to the Queensland government each year. The most common is a vehicle access permit. Then there is a commercial activity permit and a scientific permit. The figure for the past 12 months regarding vehicles that went to K'gari and Cooloola National Parks is 59,000. With a revenue to Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service a little over $4 million. An assertion of care for this UNESCO World Heritage listed jewel is viewed really as mitigated property under the stewardship of non-Indigenous bureaucrats in a hierarchy of executive directors, CEOs and managers. A reluctance to see their absolute ineffectualness to manage came to public attention through an ABC journalist, Rachel Rigger, earlier this year. Through weeks of inaction and delays by the state's representatives from Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, they wrought massive destruction on K'gari. K'gari means paradise in our Butchulla language. It was rain from the skies above that eventually put the wildfires out in December. Nature has always been in control, not humans. Next slide, please. Next slide. K'gari is sliced and diced in so many ways that it's difficult to know who has authority over what, except for the absolute authority of the state of Queensland. The Queensland Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, seemed to be unaware of how the fires in K'gari had been handled by senior staff within the Department of Environment and Science, and QPWS until ABC investigative journalist Rachel Rigger accessed internal emails under the right to information. What came to light were a series of internal emails more concerned about downplaying the disaster unfolding due to concerns about peak tourist Christmas bookings and the financial expenditure of water bombing. I will read an extract from 3 emails and attitudes held towards the Gari wildfire. 1, a parks executive director was not supportive of water bombing because he said, "You won't put it out in the swamp and the fire isn't that bad to warrant such action." 2, the then Assistant Director General, Department of Environment and Science, Neil Cambo, writes, "There really is no news. Yes, it's a fire, there's smoke. It's travelled 50 kilometres. It's in remote areas of the island. Nothing's at risk. The large bomber cost us about $12,000 an hour. So we are probably burning more money than anything else." 3, dated the 25th of November. "It's unnecessarily alarmist and out of context. The areas mentioned are inconsequential places, and that will scare people off from making Christmas bookings to the resorts." On the 24th of November, the fire was declared a critical incident. Next slide, please. On the 12th of October, 4 men in their 20s camped at Orange Creek on the eastern side of the island had inadvertently set Gari alight after not properly extinguishing a fire when they left their campsite. They were charged with unlawfully lighting fires, with one of the men also facing an additional charge of leaving a fire unattended as a result of their campfire reigniting. In January and February this year, following the hearings at Harvey Bay Magistrates Court, all 4 responsible for the fires were each fined $667 each. One man who pleaded guilty to the second charge was fined an extra $667. In addition, each had no conviction reported. It is estimated that the fire burnt through 87,000 hectares of the island. Next slide, please. The fire on Gari burned for 2 months, and following this event, the State of Queensland Inspector General Emergency Management provided a report titled Gari Fraser Island Bushfire Review Report Number 1, 2020-2021. Factors like high temperatures and strong northerly winds and build-up over decades of dry understory lent to fueling the wildfire on Gari. What followed were 78 written public submissions, community engagement with Butchulla people and the broader community who attended 5 forums on the island and mainland. It is stated that the review found opportunities to strengthen collaboration with the Butchulla people. The review put forward 38 recommendations. In the beginning, Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service took the role of incident controller from the 14th of October. The fire burned till the 16th of December 2019. Water bombing aircraft were first deployed on the 9th of November. This was preceded by 3 weeks of wildfires moving further west, north, and south. The report identifies a total of 30 aircraft were later used, dropping over 13.3 million litres of freshwater, saltwater, and gel additives. Next slide, please. On the 27th of November, QPWS handed over incident control to Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. The report states that the Butchulla Aboriginal Corporation were requested to join the incident control location, now led by the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. Due to the duration of the fire and increasing in size, threatening various townships and cultural sites on the island, it was attracting media attention locally, nationally, and internationally. The townships threatened were Orchid Beach, Dundabara Campgrounds, Cathedral Beach, Gurry Camp, Happy Valley, Yidney Rocks, the Oaks, and Kingfisher Bay Resort. Within the IGEM report, there are 38 recommendations, 5 of which specifically pertain to or refer to the Butchulla people. They are recommendations 8, 9, 10, 17, and 29. Recommendation 8 is the most important for Butchulla rangers who work on the island. It states, the Inspector General Emergency Management recommends a prescribed burn program for Gurry be developed by the Department of Environment and Science in collaboration with the locality-specific fire management group and the Butchulla people, based on the principles of the national position on prescribed burning. This program should incorporate a process for monitoring and evaluation of outcomes and integration of evolving fire management practices. Since this report was released with its recommendations, QPWS did a prescribed burn in a location near Mackenzie Lake. Before the burn took place, one scar tree was identified on country by Butchulla man and Senior Cultural Advisor Dustin Curry. Post the burn, the scar tree was incinerated to ashes. At a meeting on the 24th of September this year, 2 directors on the Butchulla Aboriginal Corporation and General Manager were told a month and a half after regarding the event that this had occurred. The scar tree is no longer. Cultural sites on Butchulla country are disappearing fast, and we feel these losses deeply as a people. A paternalistic attitude permeates QPWS in how they think they know better than Butchulla people. Co-management of the island is not evident at this point in time. Next image, please. After the huge 2019-2020 wildfires, an Indigenous voice came to the fore on national TV. An eager journalist sought out his expertise and opinion. This was Victor Stephenson. In 2020, Victor Stephenson published Fire Country, How Indigenous Fire Management Could Help Save Australia. In Fire Country, Victor writes, the knowledge gap started from when the old people were separated from their country. This affects large swathes of land due to the colonial project carried out here. Most settler Australians are disconnected from the land. Western agencies treat fire using terminology such as hazard reduction and prescribed burns. The Western mindset revolves around life, property, fear, and firefighting. Victor Stephenson learnt his knowledge by being on country and working with 2 senior Aboriginal traditional landowners, Dr. George Musgrave and Dr. Tommy George, who received honorary doctorates from James Cook University in Cairns. It was a struggle for them to burn country in the early part of their formative work together due to the restrictions by QPWS and a fear of fire by adjoining property owners. Slowly a change started to emerge over a long period of time. In the chapters from Fire Country, we read about the fire management practice that was carried out by all sovereign nations across Australia. This knowledge as Indigenous people is based on 65,000 years of intimate understanding of this continent. Our approach to managing fire is holistic. Cultural burns are conducted seasonally and symbiotically, working in with winds, rains, and other plant indicators. The advantage of cool burns practiced by Indigenous people was to generate growth. Stephenson identifies these complex layers, a sophisticated form of land management based on creating food. The mosaic pattern of burning country is important to support the diversity and needs of different species. It is a method that does not allow build-up of fuel loads from dead vegetation such as fallen branches and leaves. They are also called cool burns because they are low to the ground and the canopy of trees are not burnt or scorched. In opposition, the management of Australia since colonisation has engaged in a methodology where Western fire regimes are based on hazard reduction. There has been a lack of ability to read country and a continual reluctance to burn country through learning from Indigenous knowledge systems or living knowledge holders. Some of this knowledge has been lost due to colonisation of lands and knowledge holders no longer here. What has happened is that large sections of country have not been burned annually like a patchwork mosaic. Stephenson writes, neglected country with a build-up of lots of fuel, then there's a problem. The worst thing that can happen is a wildfire setting off and accumulating ticking time bomb. The cost to the Queensland state government in trying to put out the fire on Gari was $21 million. I will end on this thought from Victor Stephenson and other international commentators who acknowledge that trees are so special, they are the lungs of our earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was an incredibly informative and beautifully organised talk. There's so much here, and yeah, I would like to invite Lana or Isabel to begin just with some reflections and or questions to Fiona before opening up to the cool scholars and then the rest of the group. Those who are not cool scholars, it's so great to see everyone here, by the way. And I did mean to thank Amy as well for all her work behind the scenes. So thanks, Amy, and great to see you here. So please, if you're not a cool scholar, or Isabel or Lana, put your questions in the chat and I hope to get to them. But yeah, is Isabel or Lana, who wants to go?
I can start if you want, Lana, or unless you want to go. I want to start by saying thank you so much, Fiona. This has been an incredible talk. As Fiona Nichols said, it was beautifully organized and visually impactful. And I think it left us with a lot of things to swallow about what is happening at this particular time. And for me, it made me think and made me make some connections about a lot of things, particularly the importance of Indigenous knowledge and fire in solving some of the current issues of our time, particularly climate change. And something that I gather from your talk that I think that is extremely important is that we cannot talk about climate change without actually talking about colonialism, without actually talking about the violence that has brought us to where we are at this particular time. And you show that really well in your work and also in your art, in this idea of that through the utilization of different materials, you are telling colonial narratives that are extremely important to understand where we are at the moment. And as you were speaking, I also was thinking about what is happening in BC with the mudslides and also the floods, and simultaneously what the Wet'suwet'en people are going through in fighting against gas link, for example, and the continuation of an extractive economic model that has brought us where we are in the first place. And despite all of what is happening in terms of these changes and these natural disasters that have been human-induced, sort of like the overall narrative, economic narratives, continues to be one and the same, right? So, and that's something that you make me think about. But at the same time, you're towards the end of your talk, when you're talking about Indigenous knowledge, and particularly Stephenson, and what he was saying about Indigenous knowledge and fire, it also reminds me about the ways in which Indigenous knowledge has been historically devalued, and how, and make me remind me about people from the homelands, from my homelands, and where the territories that I come from, where they also have known since time immemorial about their territories and the use of fire as a way of controlling or cleaning or protecting their ecological context, and how Western knowledge and even a lot of environmentalists have at times framed Indigenous peoples who've used cultural burns as fire setters, right? Like, and this has been used specifically in where I come from in Oaxaca, where Indigenous peoples have been sort of represented as these ignorant fire setters, instead of understanding the why these actions have taken place, right? And I think that the other thing that your talk left me with is that you're not just telling stories about colonialism and violence and climate change. I think that in a way you're also, you ended up with somehow a hopeful note about Indigenous knowledge and about the possibility of actually centering Indigenous knowledge in order to think about Indigenous futures, and indeed everybody's future possibilities. So to me, in your talk, you were sort of talking a lot about storytelling, art storytelling, right? Like that's in my mind how I sort of envisioning your work as a way of art storytelling. That's what it tells me as an Indigenous person from Southern Mexico. That's the way that I'm relating to what you're talking about, and the ways that I can make these connections about what we're experiencing everywhere, right? Which is climate change, and the importance of centering colonialism and the violence colonialism in these conversations, and at the same time, the need to listen to Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in order to solve the challenges of our time. And I will leave it here.
Well, I think, with Victor Stephenson's book, he does have the byline, how Indigenous fire management could help save Australia. So there is hope if non-Indigenous people managing different parts of the country, either national parks or different terrain in the state, particularly in the south, the states of New South Wales, Victoria, came on board with working with Aboriginal knowledge holders. So I'm a director on the Butchulla Aboriginal Corporation, and we've got the dilemma now, exactly what Victor talks about is we don't have those knowledge holders for how to burn country anymore because we were so dispossessed and taken off the island in 1904. But before that, we were a part of these frontier wars and a 20-year guerrilla campaign fighting back. So we lost from about 2,000 original peoples. Our numbers dwindled down to just over 100. So we've had huge losses of population and then to be finally removed off our country. So there are knowledge gaps there. So my young nephew, who's a ranger on K'gari, did a recent burn. It was his first burn and it was very successful. Around K'gari Camp was the location. But there were a lot of mechanisms put in place with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and the Butchulla Aboriginal Corporation for that to be conducted and for that to go ahead. So now country, particularly K'gari, is tightly controlled and managed. Butchulla people, if I was to go there and wanted to light a fire, I would be fined for that. So it's, you know, the bureaucracy that's overlaid on Indigenous people in this country to light a fire is extremely controlling, and it's very restricting to be able to just have a simple campfire lit on country. It's near impossible for us to do that, and that's because people are so fearful of fire. And, you know, this last wildfire that took place in 2019 means that there are more stringent controls put in place by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service because they're fearful of a fire getting away. So white people who have been tourists on our country, who set that place alight, burnt 2/3 of it, you know, we're feeling the consequences of that action as Indigenous people who are traditional owners for that country. And, you know, the travesty that when they went to be, the charges were laid against them and the litigation that unfolded where each was fined only $667 and no conviction recorded, is a slap in the face to us as Butchulla people who had to spend days and days assisting QPWS and the fire management in putting out that fire. And, you know, if there's this irony and double standards. So on the one hand, they're not wanting to learn about how to manage fire on country and read the signs and the symbols that go hand in hand with that. But, you know, Butchulla people are being penalised at the same time for gross negligence of non-Indigenous people who are tourists on our country.
Thank you. Hi for the incredible presentation of narratives of the land, of your land, as well as through your art, your visual art, your visual stories. I appreciate that you started off with one of your legends, because I think of the prophecies from our stories as the stories of Indigenous peoples, especially from our lands. And we have many prophecies that, as my uncle calls, we're going through this great renovation. And a couple of the prophecies that I think of is of one that, the first one that comes to mind that your work really reflects is is from Louis Riel, who, and a little disclaimer, apparently it was either his mother or wife who actually said this prophecy. So important of that matriarchal kind of losing those matriarchal stories. But he said that my peoples will sleep for 100 years, and when they awake, it will be the artist who gives them their spirit back. And so, you know, the importance of that visual, the visual stories, you know, because our oral traditions, we've lost so much of it, but when we're connecting to that, you know, to our spirits and a spirit, especially the spirit of this land, and through our language, as artists, you know, who come from our lands. And so I also think of the other prophecy of how, from where I am, we are now in the time of the woman. For the past 7 generations, we've been under this time of man, and now we shifted into the time of woman, where we have to help with that great renovation. And I also think of, within my language, women are called isquel, and its connection to iskotel, which is fire, because as women, we are the home fires. And the importance of, you know, when you talk about the violence of the land is also connected to the violence of the woman, and how much as women we've lost our inherent right to pass on this knowledge to the next generation. And that soul wounding that's happened. So just learning more about you, of this long line of strong matriarchs that you've come from, especially, you know, with the language reclamation. And this is something that I'm working on as well, is reconnecting to the language. And once we're reconnecting to the language, that I'm also reconnecting to the land, because the language comes from the land. And so I wonder about those influences in your work, and how much it influences your work as well. So I'm so honored, and I give you great thanks, and thank you for sharing your spirit fire with us.
Thank you, Lana. Language is really important. So my mother was a strong cultural leader, and she spent 20 years of her life researching in many archives, Western archives, for bachelor words, because by the time she was born and I was born, she taught her children all the language that she knew, which were words, but they're not fully formed sentences. So she said about creating the bachelor dictionary, which was 20 years worth of work, and she put them into different subheadings. So that's been a valuable resource for me to sometimes use in my artwork, bachelor words, and also titles for works. And so my Facebook name is 2 bachelor words, which means phantom spear point. And that's how I sort of think of myself, as someone who bursts people's bubbles. And unfortunately, I haven't spent the time to learn all the words in the dictionary, so I'm deeply ashamed of that little fact. But it has, some people have taken it up, and one of my cousins, whom I mentioned in the talk, Dustin Curry, uses language every day with his children, and that's a source for his, you know, relearning language. So I have to spend time relearning language, but where I can, I use bachelor words when I'm speaking to other bachelor people. And so there's a sense of belonging in that way, and that means that we're grounded also to country, and we're grounded to one another, and we have a relationship with one another. So where it's an area that I've got to delve into a lot more deeply, but Mum's dictionary had been out of print for 23 years, and my sister Melissa and I republished the dictionary in 2018 and again in 2019 in the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And I gave the dictionary, the newly republished, to a colleague, Tila Watson, And she formulated a song for a film that I made recently in 2019 called Out of the Sea Like Cloud. And the song is all sung in Butchulla, and it's about the first sighting of Captain Cook as he sailed past. The Butchulla people created a song that's gone down from generation to generation. And there's one verse that exists in English. So I gave her that verse. It's spoken in the film, but then she created a new 4-part verse just using Mum's dictionary. She sang that song to me in my office in Brisbane, and just unaccompanied, just by voice. And I had tears rolling down my cheeks because it was the first time I could see all of my mother's work activated in that space through song. And it was just so powerful. And language is powerful. And I have to, where I can, get back to language through my art making practice.
Thanks to both Isabel and Lana, and thanks to Fiona for an incredible engagement. And yeah, I've got some tears in my eyes about that. It must have been amazing to hear and to see Tilia. I know the power of her work, so wow. I wanted to, just before we move on to like cool scholars, if there are Indigenous people in the room who would like to contribute and just ask questions of Fiona, please do. I'll just give a moment if you have questions for Fiona that aren't for non-Indigenous. Those kinds of questions that as non-Indigenous people we just probably won't think to ask or know to ask. So I'll just leave a couple of minutes, and perhaps if people want to just stretch or just take a few deep breaths. So yeah, I'll just leave a couple of minutes of space, and yeah, if you do, you can just put it into the chat. If you've already done that, perhaps copy it again, because I'm just looking, I haven't actually seeing any in the chat right now. So either in the chat or else you can turn on your mic and your camera. So yeah, we'll come back in a couple of minutes and just chill for, yeah, that's amazing. Okay, we might start to get back together, and of course Fiona's part of this Zoom room, so you may have been sending chat messages to her already, so that's terrific if you have been doing that. And so we also decided that we would open the space to everyone who's just joined the Zoom meeting, because as Cool Scholars, we are going to be meeting with Fiona in a few days' time. So I'll just change that order a little and just ask those who are, this is a rare opportunity to engage with a remarkable artist and thinker. So I'm just going to actually open it up to any of the people in the room first. And if you're all a little awed, we will throw to some of the cool scholars. No problem, Andy. I know that some of you all have to leave as well for your various Saturday things. So yep, just check out. But I don't have any questions in the chat yet, and I don't see anybody with their microphone on. Or so. Okay, I think I will move over to a cool scholar, Selena, for the next engagement.
Hello, Fiona.
Hi.
So lovely to Zoom meet you and to hear your thoughts. I really appreciate both the opportunity for you to see your visual stories, the visual languages that you've been creating, and also to hear the stories of the effects of the fires on the land and the very immediate difficulties that people are living through. And I guess a little bit like Lana, I'm also interested in language and in words. The question I'm at the top of my mind actually has to do with the word that's you're using, an adjective you're using that's in the title of your talk, and then you use again later on. You've called your talk Twisted Firestarters. And then also later you talk about the twisted colonial thinking that the governments are using to engage with this. And I was just meditating a little bit on the word twisted. I think of it connotes a lot of things to me. Sometimes in a way, sometimes there's a morals, like if someone has a twisted soul, like they're like in that kind of like morality idea. And then I also think of it in sometimes in an embodied way, that people need to twist and contort themselves around obstructions and create, a really unsteady, ungrounded situation. So I just invite you to elaborate on your choice of that word twisted and what you're aiming at with that.
There's such a deep pathology in this country to keep Aboriginal people down, and they do that in a lot of different ways, and the state government is responsible in terms of how you keep people down. And one of the ways they can keep people down as Indigenous nations is economically. So there's a twisted type of thinking in the way that they build relationships with Indigenous people here. So one group could be quite successful in another place, but another group are very economically deprived. So one of the images I showed of was myself on stage at a state-based Queensland tourism event where I got to give a 20-minute paper. And there were two ministers from the Queensland government who were in the room, one Indigenous, one non-Indigenous. The problem for Butchulla people, and I talk a little bit about that in the paper, is that we are economically disadvantaged where we don't bring in $1 from all of the tourists that go to Gari, and there are millions and millions of tourists. You have 59,000 vehicles going to the island who pay a permit to access the island. We don't see 1 cent. So it means as a people, we don't have any capital to run any cultural events or invest money into scholarships for Butchulla children, or we are not able to, set up our own kidney machine for health purposes. So it's this ripple out effect. So the state government is very aware that we don't get any funds from all of the tourists that go to Fraser Island. And I remember when I was on the board of directors after our consent determination in 2014, I asked that the Butchulla people be given at that stage $5 from every permit that was issued. And there's no sense of sharing anything. They don't share their wealth with disadvantaged Aboriginal nations at all. This year, they've promised to entertain the thought of going into some sort of contractual arrangement where they will give us $450,000 from about the $4 million that they bring in each year. But to get that $450,000, it's stipulated. There are so many stipulations that they will not give the $450,000 in one chunk, that we have to do it contractually year by year by year. And that they're even telling us that we cannot spend more than 50% of the money on the wage of our general manager. So they're telling us how we can spend the money. So they tie you up in these knots, and we're left, cap in hand, begging for a percentage of the vehicle permits that they issue. So there's a real schism in the way that they think about how they're going to work with us as a nation. They know we're the traditional landowners for it, because that was handed down by the Federal Court of Australia back in October 2014. So they know they're working with the rightful TOs, as we say in Australia. Yet we are still the most impoverished group in the Fraser Coast region. And there's this schism. So now that means that we're reliant on Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service to employ our own people, to run any fire management programs that we might want to run. And but this is a deliberate tactic of the state government. So historically, when I was looking into the legislation of the Aboriginals Protection and the Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act, they introduced 33 clauses to control the lives on every day of the year for Aboriginal people across the state of Queensland. So there is a pathology in terms of how they think about Aboriginal people. And a part of the research I was doing this year in the Queensland Parliament in the 1870s, they were discussing islands off the east coast of Queensland as places where prisons could be set up for Indigenous people. And that is the mentality, even before an Aboriginal person had committed a crime, they're already thinking about how they criminalise Aboriginal populations. And what's internationally for your audience that you should be aware of is that this piece of legislation that confined Aboriginal people in the state of Queensland was the basis of the apartheid regime laws and rules in South Africa, comes from the Queensland legislation. So when you start to understand these larger mechanisms in life, and you understand, okay, this went from Australia to South Africa and formulated their apartheid regime, then you understand this is some deep psychology going on here, where the dominant people, white patriarchy, can enact this, take this from one country, take it to another. And so, we're talking about systematic and systemic racism in this country, and it's across all levels of society here. And I hold the state government responsible for the outcomes that they currently see with impoverished Aboriginal populations in Queensland. And this is extrapolated in every state in Australia. Why do we have the highest children's incarceration rates in the Northern Territory? Aboriginal children, juvenile delinquents make up 100% of the children incarcerated in the Northern Territory. These models are deliberate. They target people. There's no generosity of spirit in the way that they deal with Aboriginal nations.
Thanks, Fiona. And the use of the word twisted makes a great deal of sense. I mean, your description of the kinds of obstructions that are created in order to get, I mean, just like to collect the funds and what you might need to do to the obstructions created in order that you might collect a tiny portion of the funds from visitors to your land is so is really distressing and twisted morally and also just in the actions necessary to take. Isn't that just like it's very evocative. I wonder, last question quickly, have you used this that gesture or that image of twisting in any of your artworks? I'm sorry, I don't know your full extensive catalog.
No, not at this. No, it just came from listening to that song, The Prodigy. There's a line, "Twisted Firestarter," and okay. I thought, oh, that's so apt to describe what's happening here with the twisted thinking of the powers that be. It's always, white people know best. They know how to manage the country, and very rarely do Indigenous people be invited to partake in management of our own country. And that's evident on Fraser Island. We are not co-managers, and how, QPWS can do a prescribed burn around Mackenzie Lake. The scar tree was identified, and yet it gets burnt to the ground. But they don't have the guts to tell us until 6 weeks after, and I was present at that meeting, so it came as a shock. And you watch how they play things out. It's through all strategies, silencing, delay tactics, not telling you the full story at when time is present. And so last night I found out that fire on Gari cost the state government $21 million to put out. I mean, I think $21 million could have gone to the Butchler people and what we could have done with that. That's twisted thinking as far as I'm concerned. And then they didn't put the fire out. Nature put the fire out through rains.
All right, well, I'm going to let it go there. There's lots more people wanting to talk. So thank you so much for the talk and for your engagement.
Thank you, Selena.
Thanks. I've just got a statement I'll read out from Zala, who's a wonderful woman and researcher who we collaborated with on Courting Blackness. And Zala's here. And would you like to read your statement, Zala?
Sure. Wow, what a privilege it is to be with you all this morning. And thank you so much, Fiona, for your talk. I wrote, and my apologies, I just feel very passionate and really engaged with your work. I'm an educator, and I have originally, I come from a war-torn society, Yugoslavia, and my work deals with violence and sexual violence and the role of media. I teach large classes, undergraduate students, and I really believe that daily in our classrooms, we need these conversations, Fiona, really deep thinking, engaging with history, understanding history, and you bring this together so powerfully. I really thank you for that. Not shying away, from really difficult questions that, young people, when we bring this into the classrooms, we just need to insist, and commit to this, right? To continue to do, because we have, to have us all committed to thinking carefully with each other, right? And I feel, there are moments of crisis and moments of possibility, and, teaching with your work, and with your writing. I want to really say big thank you, because it's really your work a catalyst for conversation and change. I see it in the classroom, right? So it's wonderful. I can say big thank you.
Thank you, Zala.
Wow, what this is so fantastic. I have just two last questions, I think, before we start to close off. I know some of us have a chance to talk with Fiona later, so this is just the final questions from the chat. Trish and Georgine, Fiona, are just wondering if you could say a few more things about the significance of the scar tree that was burned.
Well, we have, because it's a sandy island, we don't have caves with rock art, right? So we only have material culture that's principally scar trees, where either a shield or, they've cut out the bark to make a structure for housing, or they've cut out bark to make a canoe. So these are all sorts of material culture that is still evidenced in the landscape in the Australian bush. And you can do walkthroughs of the country, and you can find either stone artefacts that have been brought from the mainland across for stone axes, or you can find these scar trees, and they're usually big old trees because they had the circumference for making a canoe or a dwelling or a shield. So they're really important. And my cousin, whom I've mentioned before, Dustin Curry, he's walked the landscape a lot on the mainland and the island. He's found a lot of these trees, and, within 48 hours of making these discoveries and identifying, telling authorities on the mainland and the island that this tree is present, he comes back more often than not, and the tree has either been cut down or the tree has been burnt down in this case. So we're just seeing more and more of our scar trees disappearing from the landscape, and it grieves us because this is our cultural heritage being destroyed. And, I've seen my sister, who's also a director on the Butchler Aboriginal Corporation, be really affected by this loss. It goes right to our soul because it's our connection with our old people, and where we once walked, where we once lived, because we've been so culturally manipulated and disrupted by white people telling us where we can and can't live on the island, or where we can and can't conduct our camp. So when we come across these discoveries, they're momentous occasions for us. They're a celebration. There's a scar tree. They could have made a canoe out of that, or they could have made a shield out of that. So you sort of start having this conversation. What did they make out of that particular tree? And this is all important historical information for us about our old people and how they walked, our country. And to lose tree after tree after tree. I mean, I've seen Dustin lose a couple of trees because he's identified them, and then the authorities have either cut them down or burnt them down. And it's just like, this is a repeat, this cycle is ongoing. And when will these people listen and respect Indigenous, or the Butchler people, in this case, the Butchler people? And to be told the whole tree, and they showed us the photograph before and after. So the tree was there, and then it's just a pile of ash. My God, that, how can they do that? But they did do it, and there's no recompense for that. They just did it, and that's it. So the Butler people are left scratching their heads, but how did we get compensated for that scar tree that they burnt down inadvertently? Like the fire was set alight inadvertently by those 4 young white lads in their 20s. And this is like, and we don't know how many scar trees or cultural sites of significance were burned in that fire, and it's just ongoing. And then you read the IGEM report, and it's, you know, we're in 5 of the recommendations, and they're not following the recommendations.
Thank you. It's getting time to start to wind up, but I just, there was one question from Christine Taylor, and I think maybe just, it's just about the capacities for change. And I guess I just wanted to open us up perhaps on Christine's behalf to say, you know, if you have a petition or something that we can do that is practical, particularly like around supporting, you know, getting some revenue from all of the tourists, then we would be more than glad to know about that. So thanks, Christine, for inviting Fiona to, if you want to share anything practical. And I might, and we've got a thanks from Trish, who says, you know, you've explained so well the tragedy and the loss, just about this point now, about these valuable, vital cultural and historical sources, and she's thanking you. And so I might just end the conversation part on a comment, which is a bit of a last question for you, Fiona. Alana says she's sure it's too soon to tell, but she's wondering if the fires will bring new or old plant life. And she's heard some stories from the fire devastations in Canada that the fires are unearthing some old plants that haven't been seen for a generation. So perhaps to end on that point about what is growing.
Well, I had the opportunity to go back home and go into some of that fire burnt country in February this year. So the new growth is proliferating, especially with the grass trees. So, you know, it's good in one sense that it's burnt all of that fuel-loaded country. And it's cleared that undergrowth that's been there for, well, let's say 100 years. So it's done that type of work. But, you know, when I did go to that fire-affected country, I certainly didn't see any animals. I didn't see any lizards. Very limited in what we did see in terms of insects, reptiles, lizards, snakes, blah, and bird life even. So I don't know how the animal species have been affected, but the positive, I'll end on a positive, is all the green shoots are happening and life is sort of coming back slowly, but you can see all the greenness in the country now.
Thanks, Fiona. Just, I guess, would like to, you know, express our thanks in whatever way we can. And yeah, I just want to remind people that it is Kios and the co-laboratory that has sponsored this. And if you're interested in finding out more, do get in touch with Kios to subscribe to the newsletter and to propose collaborations. And I just really wanted to thank everyone for coming here. It's been an incredible event, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation in the larger group and also in a smaller group quite shortly. So thanks, everyone.